Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome all those who are joining us on our heritage.org website as well. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy check that your mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And, of course, those watching online are welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And, of course, we will post the program on our homepage for everyone's future reference. Leading today's discussion is John Malcolm, the Ed Gilbertson and Sherry Lindbergh Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow. He also serves as director of our Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Prior to joining Heritage, he held a variety of positions, including serving as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, as Executive Vice President in charge of anti-piracy operations at the Motion Picture Association of America, and also as the General Counsel at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Please join me in welcoming John Malcolm. John?
Thank you, John. Well, welcome to Heritage. I appreciate you all being here today for the continuation in our Preserve the Constitution series. I hope that a number of you will be back on November the 10th for our post-election wrap-up to our Preserve the Constitution series and the future of the Constitution under the next administration. So, other than perhaps abortion and this election, there are very, very few topics that engender as much passionate and often discordant debate than the Second Amendment. And of course, in a very real way, the Second Amendment is on the ballot this year. And that is because Justice Antonin Scalia, who wrote the majority opinion in Heller versus District of Columbia, passed away, and the next president will, in all likelihood, have the opportunity to fill that vacancy. In Heller, the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment means that individuals have a fundamental right to keep and bear arms, which at a minimum encompasses a right to possess a handgun in one's own home for self-defense. Now, like all fundamental rights, the Second Amendment is subject to reasonable restrictions. However, to gun control activists, all restrictions are reasonable restrictions. We are fortunate to have with us today three of the foremost authorities on the Second Amendment and firearms to talk about these issues. I will briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and then we will open things up to questions. Our first speaker will be Nelson Lund. Nelson received his undergraduate degree from St. John's, a master's in philosophy from Catholic University, a PhD in political science from Harvard, and a Capitol law degree from the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Patrick Higginbotham on the Fifth Circuit, and then for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the United States Supreme Court. In between these clerkships, Nelson worked as an attorney advisor at the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice, and after his clerkship for Justice O'Connor, he served for 3 years as an associate counsel to President George Herbert Walker Bush. In 1992, Nelson joined the faculty of the Antonin Scalia Law School and is now its university professor. He has written a lot on the Second Amendment, including the chapter on the Second Amendment in the Heritage Guide to the Constitution and a terrific new paper for Heritage, which is available outside for you or online to those who are watching. After Nelson, we will hear from John Lott. John got his undergraduate degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in economics from UCLA. He has held law and economics positions at several prestigious institutions, including Yale Law School, Stanford, University of Chicago, UCLA, Wharton Business School, Texas A&M, Rice, and the University of Maryland. He served for 2 years as the chief economist for the United States Sentencing Commission and for 5 years as a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. John is the founder and president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, which seeks to provide objective evidence and analysis regarding the pros and cons of gun ownership and policing activities. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman once said of John Lott has few equals as a perceptive analyst of controversial public policy issues. He's a frequent political commentator and a prolific author. He has written 9 books, including his latest book, The War on Guns, Arming Yourself Against Gun Control Lies. I've read it. It's terrific. and copies are available outside, and I'm sure that John will be happy to sign them at the conclusion of the program. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Sheriff David Clarke. Sheriff Clarke graduated from Concordia University in Wisconsin, which later honored him with its Alumnus of the Year Award in 2003. Sheriff Clarke began his career in law enforcement in 1978 as a member of the Milwaukee Police Department, receiving several promotions and moving very steadily up the ranks. He was first appointed as sheriff in Milwaukee County in 2002 to fill an unexpired term, but he has since then been elected and re-elected 4 times, overwhelmingly, I might add. In 2013, Sheriff Clarke received the Sheriff of the Year Award from the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. In 2016, he received the Law Enforcement Leader of the Year Award from the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association. Please believe me when I say that these are just a few of the many, many awards that Sheriff Clarke has received over the years. He's also been involved in professional associations and civic activities in the greater Milwaukee area, and is a frequent commentator for just about every major national news organization that you could think of, and probably a few you couldn't think of. With that, let me turn it over to Nelson Lund.
Thank you very much, John. It's always an honor to be at the Heritage Foundation. Everyone knows that the Supreme Court woke up and rediscovered the Second Amendment in 2008. It's less well known that the court's decisions are technically quite narrow. You have a right to keep some kind of handgun in your home for self-defense, but the Supreme Court has not yet gone any farther than that. If Hillary Clinton appoints Justice Scalia's replacement, it's quite likely that almost any form of gun control except a complete ban on handguns will be upheld, and who knows even about that. For that reason, I think it's especially important to step back from the law a little bit and think about how to defend a robust right to keep and bear arms outside the courts. This right is a vital element of the liberal order that our founders handed down to us. They understood that those who hold political power will almost always strive to reduce the freedom of those they rule, and that many of the ruled will always be tempted to trade their liberty for empty promises of security. The causes of these political phenomena are sown in the nature of man. The U.S. Constitution, including the Second Amendment, is a device designed to frustrate the domineering tendencies of the politically ambitious. The Second Amendment also plays an important role in fostering the kind of civic virtue that resists the cowardly urge to trade liberty for an illusion of safety. Armed citizens take responsibility for their own security, thereby exhibiting and cultivating the self-reliance and vigorous spirit that are ultimately indispensable for genuine self-government. While much has changed since the 18th century, for better and for worse, human nature has not changed. The fundamental principles of our regime and the understanding of human nature on which those principles are based can still be grasped today. Once grasped, they can be defended. Such a defense, however, demands an appreciation of the right to arms that goes beyond the legalistic and narrowly political considerations that drive contemporary gun control debates. Regrettably, too many American opinion leaders, forgetting or rejecting the reasons that justify this right, have been extremely uncomfortable with the Second Amendment. The progressive left, for example, has largely been united in promoting restrictions on civilian access to firearms, and conservative intellectuals have offered surprisingly little resistance to conventional elite opinion. 2 of our most erudite popular pundits, for example, have called for amending the Constitution. George Will regards the Second Amendment as an embarrassment, and he wants it repealed. Charles Krauthammer goes even farther. He favors useless gun control laws because they will, and I'm quoting him, desensitize the public to the regulation of weapons in preparation for their ultimate confiscation. The silence of many other conservative intellectuals suggests a widespread ignorance about the continuing importance of the right to arms. The founding principle of liberal political theory is the unalienable right to life, or more precisely, the right of self-preservation. It's derived directly from nature and universally acknowledged, even by those who contend that political duties arise solely from convention or agreement. John Locke, who is the true father of our Declaration of Independence, argued that reason dictates natural laws that include a duty to refrain from harming others in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. That duty, in turn, implies a right in everyone to enforce the natural law by punishing those who offend against it. And that right was not relinquished when men left the state of nature by entering into political society. Locke notes that if a thief steals everything you own, you must appeal for relief to the civil authorities. But if an armed robber tries to take only your horse or coat, you are entitled to kill him, because you may reasonably fear that he will kill you if you resist his demand. For exactly the same reason, lethal force may be used against would-be tyrants. William Blackstone made the same point when he traced the right to arms to what he called the natural right of resistance and self-preservation when the sanctions of society and laws are found insufficient to restrain the violence of oppression. For Locke and for Blackstone, the violence of oppression may come either from the government or from criminals whom the government fails to deter. The same fundamental right of self-preservation authorizes the use of lethal force against both. Consistently with Locke and Blackstone, the Second Amendment links the right of self-defense against criminals with the right of self-defense against the threat of tyranny. The right of the people to keep and bear arms is one that can be exercised by an individual to protect his own life and liberty, or collectively to resist the imposition of despotism. In an echo of Locke's insistence that there are natural duties along with natural rights, the Second Amendment also refers to the well-regulated militia as an institution necessary to the security of a free state. Unlike the armies of that time, which comprised paid volunteers, the militia tradition entailed a legal duty of able-bodied men to undergo unpaid military training and to fight when called upon to do so. Modern proponents of civilian disarmament never tire of reminding us that society has changed since the 18th century. One significant development has been the creation of professional police forces. For reasons that my fellow panelists will explain better than I can, the police alone cannot secure public safety, and they won't be able to do it any better if Charles Krauthammer gets his wish for complete civilian disarmament. Gun control laws aimed at the general population are a proven failure. Nonetheless, we see persistent efforts to compromise liberal principles and endanger the lives of law-abiding citizens by restricting their access to an essential means of self-defense. The principal roots of these efforts deserve to be called what they are: cowardice and authoritarianism. The authoritarian impulse is most conspicuous among elite proponents of gun control. The vast majority of these people are quite well insulated from the threat of criminal violence. At the pinnacle of the ruling class, proponents of gun control like Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill and Hillary Clinton have squads of heavily armed bodyguards who will protect them for the rest, for the rest of their lives. And most people in the upper middle class can safely advocate the disarmament of their less fortunate fellow citizens without fear that such regulations will have any significant effect on themselves. The regulatory elite's authoritarian agenda promises more of what has already proved to be a failure, but the moral effects on the general population are likely to be even worse. Much of the propaganda against guns is calculated to foster cowardice, passivity, and irresponsible reliance on the government. This is the effect that should most worry Americans who are committed to our nation's founding principles. The time is gone when Americans universally supported gun rights, but the American spirit of independence has not disappeared. The service members who fought back at the supposedly gun-free zones at Fort Hood and the Chattanooga recruiting station exhibited that spirit. Many millions of Americans cling to their guns, as President Obama disdainfully remarked, and frequently use those guns to defend their lives and the lives of others. Whatever the exact magnitude of their deterrent effect on crime may be, law-abiding citizens who arm themselves are exhibiting the moral temper appropriate to a free people. They do not regard their lives and safety as a gift from the government, nor do they think they should wait for the government to come along and save them when their lives or the lives of other innocent people are threatened. When that spirit is finally squashed, bureaucratic government will continue to expand, violent crime will continue to plague our most vulnerable citizens, and genuine self-government, both personal and political, will become ever more illusory. No observer of American life is more respected by conservative intellectuals than Alexis de Tocqueville. Describing a new form of oppression that he saw emerging in democratic societies, Tocqueville imagined a future power, immense and tutelary, presiding over a mass of self-absorbed individuals. This power, Tocqueville said, is absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. It would resemble paternal power if, like that power, it had for its object preparing men for manhood. But it only seeks, on the contrary, to keep them fixed irrevocably in childhood. It likes citizens to enjoy themselves, provided that they think only of enjoying themselves. It willingly works for their happiness, but it wants to be the unique agent and sole arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and provides for their needs, facilitates their pleasures, conducts their principal affairs, directs their industry, regulates their estates, divides their inheritances. Can it not take away from them entirely the trouble of thinking and the pain of living? 1,000 illustrations of Tocqueville's prescience can be found in the agenda of the progressive left. Conservative intellectuals constantly and rightly complain about the erosion of individual liberty by bureaucratic government, about the enervating effects of the nanny state, and about the suffocating atmosphere of euphemisms and repressed resentment imposed by the political correctness police. But few of these pundits raise their voices against infringements of the right of self-defense, which is the core principle on which our liberal republic was founded. Some even actively urge the government to regulate that right into irrelevance by depriving us of the tools necessary for its exercise. Whatever else has contributed to the decay of Americans' Republican spirit, forgetfulness and ignorance about the philosophy underlying our free institutions is among the least excusable failings that public intellectuals can display. Our most fundamental liberty now depends too much on lawyers and judges and too much on associations like the NRA, which too many conservatives regard as just another special interest lobby that sometimes serves as a convenient political ally. Conservatives should pay more attention to the views of John Locke, William Blackstone, and every one of our founding fathers. Their philosophy was not infected by some silly romanticism about guns or an outmoded frontier mentality. It was based on the reality of human nature and on reason. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank John for setting this up, and it's quite an honor to be on the same panel as both Sheriff David Clarke and Nelson Lund, two people who I admire a lot. I wanted to talk about a little bit different angle here, and that is who exactly is affected by these different types of gun control laws there. You know, my research, anybody who's read it, one thing I'm convinced about is that police are probably the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And the problem with a lot of these laws that are being passed, in fact, I'd argue almost all of them, is that they primarily disarm law-abiding good citizens, particularly poor minorities, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. So I thought I'd take a law that, or a type of regulation, background checks on private transfers that Hillary Clinton, according to WikiLeaks, is promising that she's going to be enacting by executive order somehow during her first 100 days, and talk about exactly how this works and who it hurts. You know, when everybody thinks we all want to try to keep criminals from getting a hold of guns, but what I don't think most people realize is what a mess the current background check system is. You can go to Hillary Clinton's website, and she said this many times, that there's 2.4 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of the Brady background checks. That's simply false. What she should say is that there have been 2.4 million initial denials. And there's a huge difference between those terms. I'll give you a simple example. Many of you may know that the late Senator Ted Kennedy was stopped from flying on a plane 5 times because his name was similar to somebody else, somebody connected with the IRA that the British had given us a name for, whose name was on the no-fly list. Now, would we count those 5 times as 5 times we stopped a terrorist from flying? Presumably not, right? They're mistakes. But that's essentially how they count the 2.4 million. We don't know exactly the right number because we can't get precise data from the government. But it's something about 99% or so of those 2.4 million denials were mistakes. Law-abiding citizens who simply had names similar to criminals or others that we wanted to stop from buying guns. Private companies do background checks on employees all the time. If they had an error rate 100th the rate of the errors that the federal government has, they'd be sued out of existence. And there's a reason why the federal government puts those types of restrictions on companies, and that is because they're concerned that the errors there would have disproportionate impacts on minorities. And there's a simple reason for this. When you buy a gun, you fill out what's called a 4473. You put down your name, your social security number, your address, and your birthday. When a private company does a background check, they use all that information. When the government does a background check, what they do is they use phonetically similar names. Don't even look to see whether the middle name's the same. You could have one person whose name is Smith, spelled with an I, and another person whose name's Smith with a Y and an E at the end. As far as the government's concerned, they're the same people that are there. And then they don't look at the social security number, they don't look at the address, they look at the birth date. Now, when you have 2.4 million people approximately that have been stopped, you're going to run into some people who may have really needed a gun quickly for self-defense. At least in the past, they would eventually go back and check most of these cases and realize after a year or something that they've made a mistake. But there are a couple things to point out here. One is that people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. 40% of Vietnamese in the United States have the same last name. Hispanics tend to have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. About 30% of black males in the United States are legally forbidden from owning a gun because of past criminal history. Who are their names most likely to be confused with? Law-abiding, good black males who may be wanting to go and buy a gun to protect themselves and their families. So it's easy to go and fix this, okay? All you'd have to do is have the federal government have to follow the same types of rules for doing background checks that private companies have to do when they go and do background checks. I've brought this up to gun control advocates and to Democrats for 15 years. There's absolutely no interest in trying to go and fix this. Another type of problem that you have is the cost. When President Obama from the White House talks about pushing these laws, and after each of the mass public shootings, there's 2 statements that he makes consistently each time. One statement is that the United States is unique in terms of mass public shootings, and that's not true. I have a couple chapters in the book that shows that that's not the case. The other thing that he says each time is the one law that he calls for is background checks on private transfers of guns. Of course, it's one of these situations where if a reporter sometime would get the nerve to go and ask the president, could he point to one of the cases that he's talked about that it would have stopped, if his law had been in effect, that would have stopped the mass public shooting, the president would have to say he couldn't name one. In fact, he couldn't name one during his whole administration that it would have stopped in terms of mass public shootings. In fact, he couldn't even name one in years before, at least since 2000, that it would have stopped. But yet we have these laws being pushed based on horrible events that the law would have absolutely nothing to do with stopping. But when the president talks about this from the White House, one thing you may not realize is that to privately transfer a gun in Washington, D.C., it costs $125 to go and do a background check on a private transfer. In other states, it's not as bad. In Washington State, it's about $60 to do it. In Oregon, it's as cheap as $55. You know, the point is, whether it's $55 or $125, those fees may not stop you or I from being able to go and get a gun, but the poor minorities who live in high-crime urban areas, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, $125 here in D.C. may make the difference between whether law-abiding citizens able to go and defend themselves and their family or not. I'll give you something to think about. In 2013, when Colorado was passing its background check on private transfers, I got calls from some state legislators. And they asked me what amendment would I recommend that they put up there on the bill that was going through at that time. And my suggestion was to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax on transferring guns. In Colorado, you pay a state tax, and then you also have to pay the licensed dealer to go and do the background check. With the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats in the state house, every other Democrat in the state house voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay that tax. How many taxes can you think of where Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay? In Maryland, in 2013, they passed a new law for licensing and registration of handguns. It costs over $200 plus lots of time to go through the process to register and license a handgun in Maryland. I had similar conversations with state legislators there. They tried to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state fees and taxes that were there. Since the Democrats controlled 2/3 of both the State House and the Senate, they wouldn't even let the amendments come up for a vote in those cases. You know, again, you have to ask yourself, if these guys really wanted to go and get background checks passed nationally, and I talk to people when I'm in green rooms or doing debates. There's lots of gun control advocates I've talked to over the last decade, almost 2 decades. I've brought up, at least for the last 15 years, I've said, look, you can reduce a lot of the opposition that exists for these background checks if you make just a few simple changes. Fix it so there's not these mistakes, so that you're stopping law-abiding good citizens from being stopped from buying guns. There's no excuse for overwhelmingly stopping poor law-abiding minorities from being stopped. And the problem has gotten worse under the Obama administration, because what's happened, at least in the past, the government would go and check to see whether they'd made a mistake. It may take a year, may take a year and a half for them to fix it. President Obama has removed every last single person who used to double check to see whether mistakes were being made on background checks. Nobody's doing that now. Now you can appeal. The process is relatively complicated. Most people are going to have to hire a lawyer to go and fix that. It costs thousands of dollars. Again, who are they stopping by having this? It's going to be primarily, disproportionately, middle income and poor blacks and Hispanics who are going to be disproportionately stopped as a result of having to go and hire lawyers to fix mistakes that are the government's fault that they shouldn't even be doing to begin with. Look, as an economist, if I believe that background checks reduce violent crime rates, and I don't, and I'm happy to talk about why that's the case and why the academic literature overwhelmingly doesn't find benefits for it, it would be a benefit for everybody. Not just the individual who's going out and buying a gun. In fact, I would argue that the law-abiding citizen who's going out of his way to do a background check on a private transfer is kind of the last person you have anything to worry about. But as an economist, what I would tell you is if you believe, whoever you believe benefits from a government service should be the ones who primarily pay for it. And in this case, if everybody is supposedly going to benefit from lower crime rates, then it should be paid for out of general revenue. It shouldn't be just the individuals who are going and buying the gun. If you go and suggest to gun control advocates, you should try this sometimes, particularly if there's anybody in power, in an important position, a gun control group, just suggest to them that the background checks be paid for out of general revenue, all right? They will go nuts. It's like holding a cross to a vampire. And I think when you combine this with the fact that they have so strong, they fight against things like in Colorado or Maryland, the question is, they seem more concerned about passing rules that will disarm people, particularly minorities and poor people, than they are in getting it passed. Because as I say, if they could just make two simple changes, pay for this out of general revenue, fix the system so you don't have overwhelming mistakes, you would reduce a lot of the opposition. The third thing that they would have to fix to completely eliminate the opposition to these background checks would be to set it up so it wouldn't be creating a registration system. Because the concern is that, if you have background checks on all private transfers as well as the sales, FFLs have to keep, federally licensed dealers have to keep tracks of the 4473 forms that are filled out, even though the federal government's banned from creating a registration list. And after 6, 7, 8 years, you may have a future President Hillary Clinton who would decide, we're going to have some edict that in order to keep your FFL license, she's going to have an executive order requiring that they have to copy the forms and send them in somehow to the federal government or pass a law at that time. And you have kind of an instant national registration list of law-abiding citizens. The point is, I don't have time to go through this now, though I could answer in a question, and that is, we've had licensing and registration in Hawaii, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in New York. You can look at countries like Canada. But the places that we have information on, whether it's Washington, D.C., Chicago, D.C., or Canada, you just don't find any crimes that have been solved as a result of licensing and registration. It's a costly system, and again, it's just another way of trying to go and disarm law-abiding citizens and taking resources that the police could use in other ways that we know reduce crime and having them put in here. Well, I know you guys are probably here to listen to Sheriff David Clarke, so I won't take up any more of your time that's here. But I greatly appreciate the chance to go and talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to do a quick inventory of the audience here. How many students in the room? Law school students, I take it. How many lawyers in the room? People with law degrees? Okay. How many reporters? Yeah. You're the ones I want to keep an eye on. No, I say that in jest, but it's always good to know who I'm talking to. Again, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. You might be asking yourself, I know I ask myself, why am I here? Among this panel of learned men, distinguished, educated, and first I resisted when I was asked, I got enough on my plate. I provide enough opportunities for people to attack me, and I said, I'm not looking for any more. But then I thought about it for a little while, and Heritage Foundation came back again with somebody different, somebody who knew me and was able to arm twist me a little more than the first person. And so I acquiesced, and I said, okay, I'll do it. And then I tried to figure out, well, why me? I think it's this. I'm real big on education. It wasn't mentioned in my bio. I have a master's degree, and if I'm an expert in anything, it's what my master's degree in. It's from the United States Naval Academy Postgraduate School. It's in security studies, Homeland Security related. Obviously, I could consider myself an expert in enforcing the law. I'm on the front end, being a law enforcement officer for 38 years. So I look at the panel and I see Professor Lund, and I said, well, he could provide all of the legal theory, the esoteric aspects of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. And then I looked at John, who I've known for a while, and I said to myself, well, there's your source for all of the research and data that you need to know and you need to have as it relates to the Second Amendment. So you got, your designations for your college degrees, a BS, an MS, and a PhD. And someone asked me, how come you never went for a PhD, Sheriff? I said, well, here's how it was explained to me. We're all adults in the room, okay? A BS is bullshit. An MS is more shit. And a PhD is piled higher and deeper. So I figured I knew enough to muddle through what we deal with. But what I do and what I've done is I take and I think this term gets overused sometimes, I take a common sense approach to things. And so, you look at the panel here and you're going to get all your legal theory, your legal foundation, you're going to get all the research and data. I'm here to interpret this and make it kind of make sense at street level, because that's where I'm at. How does this stuff affect? John talked about it a little bit. How does this stuff affect people at ground level? What I see in this environment is we have a tendency to overthink stuff, to take stuff that's pretty basic and try to make rocket science out of it. And that might be okay in a courtroom. Don't know if it's always necessary. Because think of who takes the stand, right? Think of who testifies. Just ordinary people. Somebody who saw an event or can add something to a case or for defendant, right? They don't all have law degrees. And you even panel juries. Ordinary people who don't have this esoteric understanding of the law. And they're never going to learn it during the course of a trial. So in the end, which is what our system of justice is, and it's the way we want it to an extent other than a bench trial, is we put all of this stuff, all of the evidence, all of this legal theory into the hands of everyday people to make the determination. That's the way I want it. People with common sense that can bring their own experiences into this complex situation and try to make a determination. So that's what I try to do, because in my line of work, I'm at ground level with everyday people. And so I ask, how does this stuff affect them? So how did I get into this Second Amendment discussion, debate, discourse? It was in a strange way. Being the sheriff of Milwaukee County, there was a period of time, this is about 4 years ago, we had a very violent streak hit Milwaukee, violent crime. All right, good law-abiding people just trying to make their way through life, that were being affected on a daily basis by violent crime, street robberies, carjackings, take somebody's vehicle by force, by gunpoint, being held up at the ATM machine, home invasion burglaries by armed suspects. And I watched how the Milwaukee Police Department, where I spent 24 years, by the way, before I became sheriff, I watched how they were handling this. And they were always telling the law-abiding citizen what they should or shouldn't do. In other words, for purse snatches, we'll tell a woman, don't carry a purse. Do you know a woman that doesn't carry a purse? I don't. Maybe you do. I don't. Why are we going to tell women, well, don't carry a purse. Take your money and stuff and stick it in your pocket. Why would we do that to people? And so I sat up there and watched, and in one particular instances of a rash of home invasion burglaries, where people were after plasma TVs, that was when they first became a big thing. And the advice from the police department was, if you buy a plasma TV, don't take the box and just throw it out at the garbage cart. Cut it up into little pieces so that when people are casing a neighborhood, they don't see that box out there and say, aha, these people just bought a plasma TV. And I thought that was the craziest thing that I had ever heard. Because I know when I bought my first plasma TV, The only thing I was interested in was getting that bad boy out of that box, setting it up, and turning it on and watch it. I did not want to then go out to the garage and start cutting the box up into little pieces. I thought, this stuff is crazy. So I thought, we got to do something different here. All right, because what happened over time with policing is we pushed the average law-abiding person who's supposed to play a role in this thing if we're going to be successful. We're not a police state here. The police are not omnipresent. I don't want to live in a country where the police are omnipresent. And the way modern policing was designed, Sir Robert Peel, was the citizens have to play a role in order for this to be successful. As a matter of fact, he said, the police are the citizens are the police. The only difference is the police get paid full-time to pay attention to crime, violence, and disorder. Citizens do not. That's the only difference. But they have to play a role. But over time, we started pushing law-abiding people out of this equation, and what did we tell them to do? Just call 911. Just call 911. That worked for a little while, until the 911 system got overwhelmed. Not only with serious calls for service, but some crazy stuff like the pizza didn't get delivered in the right way. I mean, you've heard the stories, right? So the system got overwhelmed. So what happened over time is that people were waiting longer and longer time for a police officer to show up for some very serious stuff. And I looked at the data and the research on calls for service, and on average, for a call of a sexual assault, it was taking like 40 minutes for the police to show up. Can you imagine being the victim of a rape and having to wait 40 minutes for a squad to show up? Now, look, I've dealt with, when I said I'm at ground level, I've dealt with these victims. You know, the first thing a woman wants to do after that horrid thing happens is take a shower. You know what we tell them on the phone? Don't take a shower because we want to preserve the evidence. I get that. But then the least we could do is get there quickly, get the evidence we need, and help this woman start to put her life back together and get her life under control, not wait 40 minutes for a squad to show up. So I'm listening to all this stuff. I said, this isn't working. This model is not working. Just call 911 and wait. And so I did something which was old school. I said, let's go back to what policing was supposed to be originally, as Sir Robert Peel designed it. Let's have the citizens play a role in their own safety. You know, there was a time in this country when crime was under control and, you know, the police could get there in a reasonable period of time and they cleared a lot of these crimes. It doesn't work anymore. And so I put out a 30-second public safety announcement radio ad. 30 seconds on the radio. Advising people of what to do. Advising them, not telling them. And one of the things I mentioned in that ad, I should have brought it along. It's 30 seconds. Pretty basic stuff. I said, consider taking a firearms safety course so you can protect yourself and your family until we get there. That was the gist of the ad. That sounds pretty reasonable to me. Consider taking a firearms safety course because, as you know, with rights come responsibility. With the Second Amendment comes responsibility. And one of the responsibilities of owning a firearm is the safe handling of that firearm and the safe storage. Because recently, we just had, and if you look at the Center for Disease Control, they'll give you the stats on this where young kids, we had a 4-year-old get a hold of a gun. Shot and killed his mother riding in the back seat of the car because the gun was stored under the seat. See, safe storage. That's why my ad said, that's all it said, consider taking a firearms safety course. And that was turned around by the anti-gun movement as, that's an irresponsible sheriff from the, statement from the sheriff. He just told everybody to go out and buy a gun. Never mentioned it in my ad, but this is what we're up against. Okay, so you can present all the data you want. We can win the argument on the data and research. But the question is, can we win the emotional argument? Because that's where we don't do such a good job, which is why I try to deal with this stuff from a common sense perspective. You know, in other words, I put myself in somebody else's shoes. Background checks. It's nothing more than a slippery slope toward total gun confiscation. Look, the left, the anti-gun left, I should say, I don't want to paint this broad brush. There are a lot of people on the left that are firearms owners. The anti-gun left knows there is no public support for a huge shift in the Second Amendment through the constitutional process of amending the Constitution. They know it. It's been polled. There is very little. Overwhelmingly, when it's polled, people say, no, leave the Second Amendment alone. So they know they're not going to be able to do it through the constitutional process. If we think the Second Amendment is so poorly written, I don't. I think it's pretty clear. But if we think it's so poorly written, we the people, we could change it. There's a process within the Constitution to amend the Constitution. Let's amend the Constitution. We've done it 27 times. We can do it 28. But the anti-gun movement knows there is no public support through a convention of states or through the congressional process of amending the Second Amendment. So they do it in a very sneaky way, in a very underhanded way. One of the ways they do it is through activist courts. But one of the things that they realize, too, is that this is an elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One spoonful at a time. And eventually you'll have consumed that entire elephant, and that's what they're doing. That's what all this stuff is about. These gun control measures. They don't work. They never have. They know. The anti-gun movement knows this stuff doesn't work. They've conditioned us over time. Because up until recently, when I say recently, maybe the last 30, 40 years, gun ownership in this country was never questioned. It was rarely challenged. The right of the people to keep and bear arms. It was rarely challenged. So over time, they have conditioned us away from guns. Guns are bad, guns are dangerous, and it was this very subtle way of doing it to now people, to the point where people are afraid of guns. Even though automobiles kill more people than firearms, we're not afraid of cars, though, are we? Because we haven't been conditioned into looking at a vehicle and saying, well, that's scary stuff. I got to stay out of there. And as we know in life, there's no such thing as absolute zero risk. There's risk in everything. Just like driving a car. There's a chance someone could run a red light and kill you. But we assume some of this risk. We say, well, it's worth the risk. But all of a sudden with guns, we're looking for zero risk. Doesn't exist. But here, I'm going to close with this. Here's where this really came home to me. But when I did that ad, that got me sucked into this Second Amendment thing, which I really didn't want. It just wasn't my forte. But I went back and started doing my homework and my research, as I do when I take on a new issue. I say, let me go learn about this whole thing. Here's one of the most that I found. It's not the only one, but Stephen Holbrook, That Every Man Be Armed, if you're looking for something to read. I think this is one of the. I said one of the. John's got good ones. Other people have good ones. But I think this is one of the most comprehensive, easy to understand books on it says the evolution of a constitutional right. But what I learned in this book really brought it home for me. And it was on the black tradition of arms, which I'll be honest, I didn't know about. Tradition of arms, the black tradition of arms. And the fight by the abolitionists, post-slavery, for blacks to be able to be armed. Do you know that gun control, early gun control, was really about keeping guns out of the hands of black people? We as black people have been so separated from our history. It's astounding to me. We should be some of the most ardent supporters of the Second Amendment because of our history with not being able to possess arms to defend ourselves from mobs, kidnappings, and lynchings. it was the firearm. The 13th Amendment freed the blacks on paper. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment that made the rest of this Constitution, including the Second Amendment, apply to black people, that we truly became free because we could defend ourselves. It's the first law of nature, self-defense. We all want to live. So I just want to read you a short passage out of here of what the mindset was at the time by some abolitionists as it related to the Second Amendment. Frederick Douglass strongly supported the right of fugitive slaves to have and use weapons to resist kidnapping. When government failed, this is a quote from Frederick Douglass, when government fails to protect the just rights of any individual man, that man rests on his original right of self-defense, even if it means, unfortunately, shooting down his pursuers. Douglass added, slavery is a system of brute force. It must be met with its own weapons. Yet slaves without arms could never attain freedom. The escalating possession of firearms by both free blacks and slaves during the Civil War played a key role in emancipation and in the protection of their basic rights. Black civilians were forced to arm themselves privately against mob violence. This was printed in a black newspaper at the time. The colored men who had manhood in them armed themselves and threw out their pickets every day and night, determined to die defending their homes. This is stuff you guys, I say you guys, I don't mean that pejoratively, you take it for granted. Yeah, we defend our homes. We weren't allowed, my ancestors weren't allowed to do this. It says most of the colored men in Brooklyn who remained in the city were armed daily for self-defense. Slaves plus guns equal abolition. The U.S. Congress recognized the key role that the bearing of arms had played in the freeing of the slaves. The abolition of slavery was inevitably due to the arming of blacks. I read this stuff and I said, wow. My ancestors, the abolitionists, fought for me to be able to defend myself and you, but the right already applied to you. And you think I'm going to cede this back to the federal government after what they went through to attain this right? I said, you got to be kidding me. And it was at that point that I then joined the crusade in defense of the Second Amendment. Thank you very much.
My apologies, Sheriff Clarke, for inadvertently overlooking your master's degree, and you filled just the role that we had in mind when we invited you, so thank you. With that, I think we have a few minutes left, and I want to turn directly to your questions. So when I recognize you, wait for a microphone to be handed to you. Please identify yourself. Keep it brief, no speeches, end it with a question mark. Let's go right here.
Hello, Mike Webb. I was involved, kind of still involved in a congressional race over in Virginia. One of the things that we had to deal with was kind of the fourth leg of the stool. Not the law enforcement aspect, not the academic, not the law, but the practical aspect of activism. How do you actually get this stuff enacted? We came up with this idea of the Sentinel program, basically where what we would do is take officers that are coming off of active duty and giving them a federal law enforcement carry privilege. This seemed to be, I guess, at least palatable to liberals because we're one of the most liberal districts. But I wanted to find out what your thoughts were on that in terms of doing that kind of as a halfway measure to get guns in places where we can't. It kind of disrupts the threat thinking plan because they don't know who's coming in.
Sure. Yeah, you know, I think it's H.R. 215 or 218, which allows law enforcement officers after they retire to still maintain their carry privileges, but they have to be given approval by the agency they retired from. They have to take a training course every year. And I believe, see, what it comes down to, what you're talking about, basically the anti-gun movement doesn't trust law-abiding citizens. Okay, I like the idea of, you know, retired law enforcement, former military, but not everybody is retired law enforcement and former military. What about the person who isn't? They have just as much right as anybody else. So, yeah, that's been addressed. You said that it had some support from. Yeah, don't buy it. Okay, it's.
We also got like ROA.
Yeah. Oh, they're saying that, but in the end, you know, I'm very careful about pulling out certain people, you know, retired military, retired law enforcement officers. It's not a bad idea, but I want this right because it belongs to you, it belongs to the individual, and I want it to apply to everybody. So anybody who by law can possess and own a firearm. We get into this issue with schools where even law enforcement officers off duty, active law enforcement officers can't drop their kid off at school and not be in violation of the law because they're armed. I mean, this is insane, right? So, yeah, I support that sort of thing, but this is everybody's right, and I want everybody to be able to.
Okay.
Can I just say something real
Yeah,
quick?
go ahead, John, and then we're going to come down here.
Yeah, for like 10 years, that law that the sheriff is referring to was filibustered by Senator Kennedy in the Senate. It was only after, a couple years after 9/11, that they were able to finally break the filibuster. But, you know, it just shows, here we had a situation where we trust law enforcement during the day to have guns, but as soon as they get off duty or when they retire, you know, we somehow don't trust them to be able to have weapons anymore. But I couldn't agree more also with what the sheriff's saying. Look, I mean, it's great that we have more people carrying and that they have law enforcement experience and they can go and carry when they travel across the country. But there's still only so many people that are in that category. There's so many possible targets that are there. And the only way you're going to be able to cover everything is by allowing civilians, you know, to be able to go and protect themselves too. I'll mention one last thing, and that is, you may not know this, but in the concert hall shooting in France last year, there were 8 off-duty French police who were in the concert hall, but because France did not allow off-duty officers to be able to carry, all of them were unarmed when the attack occurred.
Okay, let's come down here.
Hi, I'm Penny Starr with CNS News, and this segues perfectly into my question because in September, when there was a terror attack on a mall in Minnesota, the man was stopped by an off-duty police officer who shot and killed him. My question is, do you think that if law-abiding citizens are armed, that they can play a role in stopping some of the terror attacks that we see domestically and even abroad? Thank you.
Well, they do. I mean, you know, my work has basically gone through over 98% of the mass public shootings in the United States have occurred in places where general citizens aren't allowed to defend themselves. And one thing you find, we don't have statements all the time, but a number of statements from these killers explaining why they picked the target that they did. They're not stupid. They know that the longer it takes for somebody to arrive on the scene with a gun, the more people they're going to be able to kill. There was a case in Detroit this spring where a father was concerned about his son's involvement with ISIS, had told the FBI put a tap on his phone, and they have an amazingly chilling conversation that they recorded where the son was explaining to a compatriot why he was planning on attacking one of the largest churches in the Detroit area. And the reason why he gave was because that church forbid anybody from having a permanent concealed handgun on church property. I have a chapter in The War on Guns that goes through and lists quotes from other people who are doing this. But the thing is, you know, you look at these different attacks in malls or movie theaters. The Colorado movie theater shooter, there were 7 movie theaters within a 20-minute drive of his apartment. Only 1 posted signs banning permanent concealed handguns. Lafayette movie theater shooting last year the same way. You go through the mall shootings, the Omaha, Nebraska mall shooting in 2007. There are 8 enclosed malls. Only 1 of them posted signs. That's the one he went to. I mean, I can't get into these guys' minds, but the same thing happened in Kansas City mall shooting, the Salt Lake City mall shooting. There were 2 malls that were posted. Again, you know, at some point, you have to realize maybe this isn't random, that it's happening. You know, if I have, and, but, you know, I have Ron Noble, maybe I'll just end with this, who was Secretary General for Interpol for 15 years, kind of Europe's version of the FBI generally. When he first became Secretary General, he was strongly in favor of gun control. But what he said was, you have these mall shootings like the one in Kenya. And he said you have two ways of trying to stop this. You can either really make it a gun-free zone, okay, or let people protect themselves. But the one thing that he learned after 15 years is that it's basically impossible to stop determined killers from finding some way of getting a gun into a soft target like a mall or a movie theater. You can put up, metal detectors, what have you, but they'll get somebody on the inside to help them get it in, or they'll find some door that they can go and prop open in order to get it in. 6 months, he was saying, is a short amount of time for these people to go and plan these attacks. So I'm sure others have something to say on it. But one thing I will say, the president, time after time, as I mentioned in my talk, keeps on saying that the United States is unique in terms of these mass public shootings. He'll say things like, no other country in the world or no other developed country in the world. That's simply false. If you take the FBI traditional definition of mass public shootings, during the first 7 years of Obama's presidency, there were 25 mass public shootings in the European Union, 25 in the United States. The casualty rate for mass public shootings in the European Union was actually 50% higher over that period of time than the casualty rate in the United States. And the rest of the world is amazingly higher. It's just that they don't get news coverage of these types of attacks when they occur. And you don't need to take my word for it. In the war on guns, I list out the cases. You can go and look them up. They just don't get news coverage in the United States when they occur. A lot of the big school shootings, you've had a couple big ones in Germany, for example, but most people wouldn't know about those things.
If I can, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, sorry.
Go ahead, and then we'll take one more question.
No.
Go ahead.
Quickly, I'm not accusing you of this, but I caution people, and I'm going to use this on myself. I don't let people take me down rabbit holes on this issue, and I'm not accusing you of that. It's a good question, but the answer is I don't know. When people say, do you think if allowing more people to go armed in these public spaces, malls, schools, whatnot, would it reduce? I say I don't know. That's not the point for me. The point is, don't take my right away to be able to defend myself if I so choose. A lot of people are uncomfortable with guns. That's fine. But because they're uncomfortable doesn't mean that I shouldn't have one. Amanda Collins, University of Nevada, Reno student. I got to meet Amanda personally. I had her out to Milwaukee to speak at an event. Was attending night school, University of Nevada, Reno, and she's a concealed carry license holder in the state of Nevada. Of course, the University of Nevada, Reno is a gun-free zone. She goes to school one night, comes out, walking to her car in the parking structure, brutally raped at gunpoint, 50 yards from the campus police building. Brutally raped at gunpoint, okay? The only reason she didn't have her gun is because she's a law-abiding citizen and the school prohibits firearms on campus. It worked to keep the gun out of her hand, but it didn't work to keep the gun out of her attacker's hands. I've said it over and over again, gun-free zones are killing fields. And they are just chosen specifically for that reason. Look at the community college in Oregon. I think it was Oregon, where this perpetrator lined everybody up, started asking them questions and then mowing them down. I don't know if armed students would have eliminated that attack, but it would reduce the carnage. Maybe he kills 3, 4 people, and I'm not saying that's okay, but he doesn't get to kill 18 because somebody, maybe, can intervene on that situation, the same with like at a mall, right? So all I say is, I don't know if it's going to reduce it, but don't take my right away. Because I may want to go armed at a school, whatever, and exercise that right to defend myself.
Well, I promised one last question, so I'll go with one last question. I want to go with one of the students. Do you want over here? Yeah, hold on, let me get your microphone.
Thank you. Nikolaj Wissing, University of Copenhagen. The violent crime rate in the United States of America, it far exceeds most of the Western Europe and other socioeconomically similar countries. Yet you call this an empty or false sense of security that we get with gun control. Can I ask one of you to give some other explanations other than the less liberal gun laws we have in Europe? for the lower crime rate?
Well, John is the expert on this, so I'm just going to say very briefly that the obvious explanation is cultural and demographic. As a matter of fact, England, the United Kingdom, has basically done what Charles Krauthammer wants and totally confiscated guns, handguns, as much as they could. After they did, violent crime went up, not down. But more significantly, in a way, the rate at which Americans kill each other with knives, fists, and clubs is twice as high as it is in England.
And drunk driving.
Yeah, right. But even if somebody doesn't think that's analogous, just typical violent street crime, it's higher in the United States than it is in England. So it's cultural and demographic differences between the countries. It's not gun control.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nelson's giving an excellent explanation. Look, I know the normal thing is just to compare places across time, and they'll say, look, the UK, for example, has strict gun control, relatively low gun ownership, and low homicides. But I would just point out what Nelson did, and that is after they banned handguns, they had a 50% increase in the homicide rate over the next 8 years. It's still lower than the United States, but it's low despite the gun control rules that they had rather than because of that. And a simple thing that I just mentioned, every place in the world that's banned guns, whether it's cities like Washington, D.C. or Chicago, or even island nations, which you think would be kind of the ideal experiment in order to go and try to control crime, stop guns, have seen an increase in murder rates after guns have been banned. There's not, you think out of randomness, you get at least one time where murder rates had gone down. You know, the United States, it's a little bit misleading to talk about a murder rate for the United States because it varies tremendously across the United States. 75% of the murders in the United States take place in 3% of the counties. So 90 out of the 3,140 counties account for about 21% of the population and 75% of the murders. And if you ever look within those counties, any type of murder map, they're very heavily concentrated in certain areas. The United States has a worse gang problem than most other countries, worse drug gang problem. I may not agree with the Obama administration precisely in terms of administrations, but they had a report that came out in 2009 claiming that up to 80% of crime in the United States was gang-related, and that the vast majority of that was drug gang-related. And just to link it in with guns, look how much effort the United States has made to try to stop illegal drugs from coming into the country. Huge amounts of effort. Let's say I could click my fingers right now and cause all illegal drugs to disappear and all guns to disappear. How long do you think it'd be before illegal drugs started coming back into the United States? If you're in El Paso, 20 minutes, maybe, something like that? How long do you think it would be before those gangs brought in the guns to protect that valuable property? It's not like the gang, if one gang steals another gang's drugs, they can go to the police and say, can you help us get them back? This other gang stole our drugs. What they're going to do is essentially set up their own militaries in order to try to control that. And if you think you're going to be any more successful in stopping these gangs from bringing in the weapons that they need to protect that valuable property, then you're going to stop them from going and bringing in the illegal drugs. Good luck to you, because I think you'll be in for a rude awakening. But, you know, if you were to go and ask people, go and try in D.C. here to find illegal drugs, how hard do you think it'd be to find it? Probably not too hard. The same groups that ultimately supply the illegal drugs are going to be the ones that can also supply things like illegal guns that are there.
If I could just add one more small thing. I think people in Europe are now beginning to discover that violent crime has some connection with cultural differences among people.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.